being launched. For that. Thank you so much for your questions, both virtually and those in the room. We truly appreciate this launch this morning. We are here for the launch of the economic development in members of the fourth estate, friends from the university and other capture technology intensive global. I request that we have signs at the back, so we have propositions here and those planning virtually, we shall take care of all sides. So.
But this report tries to understand also the incredible potential of this continent. So we will center our attention on that part and on the main message of the report. But obviously we can talk about all the other issues if that is needed. So as I said, our report underlines how Africa can become a major actor in the global supply chain. If we will be dependent only on one or few commodities, we know that that is risky. And so we have to get away from that path. Diversifying trade builds resilience and enhances innovation because a wide-based economy is key for private sector development and employment opportunities to really thrive. And that is what the demographic bonus of Africa really requires. Our framework highlights 3 export tiers that we all know about. We have the raw commodities tier, the intermediate products, and the complex finished goods. So as nations export higher tier goods, productivity and wages rise, reshaping economies. Integration into complex global supply chains is the path that we are advocating. 3 reasons that we consider that drive what we call this huge opportunity for the continent. 1, geopolitics and trade dynamics, including the African Continental Free Trade Area, renewables, and demographics. So let me go through the 3, geopolitics and trade dynamics, renewables, and demographics. Geopolitically, countries and businesses are seeking the diversification of suppliers. And this is because the reliance on one supplier is as risky as commodity dependence on one raw material, yes? So diversification and diversification of risks is something that is happening in the trade dynamics at the global level right now. Renewables, and that's a great opportunity for Africa. And this together with the African Continental Free Trade Area has incredible synergies for really participating in higher and more complex supply chains at the global level. The second reason is renewables. And we all know that this is a mineral-rich continent, basic to the supply chain in renewables, being batteries or energy renewables. We know that Africa is centerpiece for the raw materials. So the question here is how we can go up in the value addition ladder with this great possibility. And the third reason is demographics, and it's Africa's youthful population and growing consumer markets that propel tech innovation. So Africa's tech ecosystem growth is impressive. Hubs in artificial intelligence, 3D printing, and blockchain are fostering innovation and redefining supply chains. fintech and e-commerce are thriving, and Kenya is a very good example, showcasing Africa's entrepreneurship. This transformation is important for African economies, but more importantly, for African population, for its men and women. The report highlights that creating an environment conducive to technology-intensive industries would help raise wages on the continent. Currently, the minimum wages in Africa are around, in average, $220 per month. In the Americas, not only the US, but the continent, is around $670 per month. So there is an important path to follow. Our report is positive on the potential of the continent. It analyzes in depth the untapped potential in automobiles in several sectors, and we choose automobiles, solar energy, and pharmaceuticals. And Paula Kiwumi, that is the director of the African and LDCs division in UNCTAD, will get into much more detail on those areas and elaborate further the report. So African priorities must guide this journey towards high-tech potential. However, we know that investment is needed. Financial investment as much as human capital investment. And we know that this is a bottleneck. So according to the report, the value of the African supply chain finance market rose by 40% between 2021 and 2022, reaching $41 billion. But we know that this is not enough. You know, micro and small, medium enterprises are still battling, you know, and having important obstacles for the financing to be part of these supply chains, and the continent can mobilize more funds by removing barriers to supply chain finance, including regulatory challenges, high-risk perception, and insufficient credit information. However, from UNCTAD, we also underline the current global context that is extremely challenging, and we advocate for debt relief to offer African countries fiscal space to invest in strengthening their supply chains. And we know that fiscal space is needed, and here we join the voice of the President of Kenya that has advocated for the international community to really respond to the developing countries and the African countries in terms of their need to have more fiscal space and be able to have a better path of financing liquidity, investment, and obviously the issue of debt. On average, and this is something that we highlight in a report that we launched with the Secretary General of the UN on the challenge of debt worldwide. We call the report A World of Debt, global debt. This is an important number that we should remember, that African countries pay 4 times more for borrowing than the US, and 8 times more than the European countries. So for the same risk profile, African countries pay much more for their loans and for their debt than the rest of the developed world. And this must change if Africa is really to achieve its full economic potential and be a major actor in global supply chains. The UN stands committed to supporting Africa in this path, and I hope that this report and the work that UNCTAD has done in more detail in sectors and in the enablers for Africa to be able to take on this opportunity that is in front of us will help support countries in this path.
What was the motivation for this report? And quite frankly, the motivation of the report was to clearly look at the potential for Africa to integrate into these high technology intensive supply chains. Not just any supply chain, but the high technology intensive supply chains. And we looked, as the Secretary General mentioned, at the automotive industry, the electronics, renewable energy, and pharmaceutical and medical devices sector. And this is extremely timely in the global context because it outlines viable solutions to these problems, not only to the problems of these multinational firms, but also to the problems, the socioeconomic problems of Africa as a whole, the need for more decent jobs and the need for to add value to products on the continent. So the report, we then decided that we would look in and assess three main things. One is, the first thing was the new technologies and the manufacturing trends going around that Africa would need to embrace to allow it to be viable, to actually adopt and to be attractive to donors to actually be part of the global supply chain. And the second thing was we looked at very specifically, as the Secretary General mentioned also, is the issue about financing, was also the emerging financing and technology solutions that can help to address the liquidity constraints while improving operational efficiency as well. And then the third thing we focused on in the report was, of course, the recommendations of strategic policies, not only for governments, but also for the private sector and also for regional institutions and regional bodies so that they can integrate into the global supply chain. So essentially, when we talk about the global supply chain and we talk about supply chains, we're looking at three main areas. First, we're talking about procurement. Second, we talk about production. And third, we talk about distribution. Now, what are the potentials for Africa within those three sectors? First of all, procurement. Secretary General also mentioned it. The sources of raw materials, the abundance of raw materials on the continent. Secondly, when we talk about production, we talk about the demographic dividends. The youth, but not just the youth, but the high technology savvy youth that is emerging in the African continent. And today, you may note that there are over 670 or 700 incubators or innovation labs within the African continent. And within Kenya itself, there are 12 already. So there is a massive workforce that is available on the continent. And this is very critical. And also, what is important in the production cycle is the energy. Now, we are talking about renewable energy. And if you have a look at one of these atlases of renewable energy potential for the globe, you'll see Africa is one of the leaders in solar, in hydro, in wind, and in geothermal. But this is not just renewable energy. What this means is that the production can be done with energy that is clean energy. The processing of raw materials can be done with clean energy, rather than exporting the raw materials to a country which is using fossil fuels and polluting. So there is a public good that Africa can also provide to the global community. And the third thing, of course, is the distribution. And distribution essentially is infrastructure, it's air travel, it's sea, land, rail. And we know that Africa has a long way to go, but Africa over the last 15 years has made tremendous strides. It is still below the global average, but it has also shown innovation as well. We've seen during the COVID pandemic that there were no passenger flights flying anywhere else. But there was only one airline, Ethiopian Airlines, which converted all its passenger planes into cargo planes. So it was able to feed the supply chain in various with medicines and PPPs and all the rest of it, not just to Africa, but to the globe. So the innovation in that sector. Now, this is very crucial when we are talking about exporting and also talking about adding value and exporting to other parts of the continent, other parts of the world, is because there is now the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which are springing up. So for Africa, Africa can brand its products that it produces as carbon neutral, because if it's horticulture, it uses it's produced in Kenya, for example, then it is green energy used to produce that, and they're using smart irrigation as well, and you can brand this product as a green product on the global arena. So I think this is important, extremely important, not just for Africa, but also the multinational firms that want to invest as well. Now, in order for all of this to happen, the Secretary General also mentioned the point about enablers. There's certain enablers that are required throughout the continent. On the technology side, there's the need for better data, storage of data, sharing of data. There's need for technology tagging, so that you know where the products are coming from and you can track them. There's need for more digital solutions, and that, of course, requires a lot of energy as well. In addition to that, we have looked in the report, you'll see, we've run a technology readiness index of the African continent to see whether these certain countries have the minimum standards for this. And there are quite a number of them, but I'll mention just a few: South Africa, Tunisia, Morocco, and Mauritius, which are even above the global average. So this is very important. And lastly, technology and financing, using of blockchain, which is very crucial, and the credit worthiness. It's important to be able to attract investment when the investors know that the financing are going to the right place at the right time, and it's secure. One of the biggest enablers, which the Secretary General also alluded to, is the African Continental Free Trade Area. Regional integration is critical. Free movement of goods is critical. Free movement of skills is critical. And this is all important because when private investors come to Africa, they need scale. If they're going to build a car manufacturing plant, they need scale. They need to know that it can be exported throughout Africa without dealing with duty, customs, taxes, VAT. And so the whole objective of the African Continental Free Trade Area is to get rid of these tariffs, and so that they can move freely. Now, when we look at the report about what Africa actually is producing, it may sound a little bit bleak now, but the point is, if you turn to page 90 of the report, what is interesting to see there is that you can actually see the different components African countries do make, from processing of raw materials to making components to assembling these components as final products. And you will see from the maps the countries that have those capabilities. So when I go back to the African Continental Free Trade Area, it is clear that Africa as a whole has the potential to get involved in these capturing the technology-intensive global supply chain. But it needs to work together as a continent. Now, there are some examples that are already going on today. You may have heard that Ghana has just opened a Nissan factory plant in Tema. There to produce 50,000 Nissan cars. You also know that South Africa produces a lot of cars. But within these two complexes, they're also producing components for assembly of cars. So the components are not all coming from Japan. The components are also coming from African continent, which I think is a very important element. But in order for Africa to benefit from all of this and be able to use regional integration, there is a need for regional industrial development plans. And we're already beginning to see these coming to shape. For example, ECOWAS region have already established a framework policy on developing a value chain for the automotive industry. We've also seen in DRC and in Zambia, where they have already have an agreement to establish an economic zone that will deal with the development and production of batteries. So, and this is continuing throughout the continent. We know in Morocco as well that they also are producing, they've just signed a new agreement to produce Citroën EV cars. So what we are hoping is that the countries, the continent, but also the external investors and international manufacturers can see the same thing we are seeing, the opportunities for them to actually develop and get Africa involved in the global supply chain. Now, you will ask, after all I've said, the question is African supply chain ready? Well, that's a yes and a no as well. It's not a clear cut. But we believe that, as the Secretary General mentioned, the human capital, the youth, is in Africa. The natural resources, the critical minerals necessary to produce batteries and these new generation cars and these new energy sources are in Africa. 46.7% of manganese and 46.5% of cobalt is in Africa. The question we have to ask is, do we want to ship this to another continent and be processed by using fossil fuels, or do we want to keep it on the continent, develop our supply chains, use renewable sources, use the youth we have, and create decent and intellectual jobs for the up-and-coming youth of society of Africa today? So what is important then for Africa is the cluster formation of these new industries throughout the continent, harmonization of regulations, and also product registration, IPs. So the report actually details this out, gives you clear examples, and this is not just a report for the African governments, but it is also very much a sales pitch to the multinational community, to the international community, to investors, that there are great opportunities for Africa as a whole. Now, let me end there, but I'd like to say that this is an excellent read, even for you young people on a Saturday night. So I encourage you, once the embargo is over, to have a good read of it, and we look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Mimi time nikajua inaenda kuisha nikakambia. Dola sijazipata mwa.